This is episode 55 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Totaro, professor of literature and culture of early modern England at Florida Gulf Coast University, and author of several books on plague, including The Plague in Print. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
It was still in use, certainly. It was a very agile and powerful cut and thrust weapon, about the same length and weight as the rapier, possibly slightly lighter, and still considered a foundational weapon of the European martial arts well into the 17th century.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
During Elizabethan England, Shakespeare's plays were not the only innovation going on. It was a rife time of beautiful innovation in weaponry and style, and the swords and weapons of Shakespeare's England were no exception. This was a time when Italian fencing masters were coming over to England and training people in a new style of fighting that had not been seen in England before. For the 52 years of William Shakespeare's lifetime, almost directly coincides with the popularity of the rapier, which we see show up in many of Shakespeare's plays. But there are also long swords, guns, broadswords, long bows, and many other kinds of weapons present in Shakespeare's history plays, his comedies, and his tragedies. So how many of these weapons were present in Shakespeare's daily life? What was William Shakespeare's relationship to weapons? Well, here this week to help us unpack weapons in Elizabethan England, and specifically during Shakespeare's lifetime, and what we can tell about Shakespeare's plays from how he uses weapons, is our guest, Sean Flynt. Sean Flynt is a writer and public relations professional with a special interest and expertise in European arms and armor. His education in history, extensive international experience, and love for handcraft combine in the hobby of making historical knives and swords. A brief former life as an English teacher also helps him shed light on the ways Shakespeare spoke to an audience that was all too familiar with the work of those weapons. And he's here to set the record straight about Shakespeare and his weapons. Sean, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Would Shakespeare have carried a weapon as part of his daily life?
It sort of depends on your perspective. Almost everyone would have carried a knife of some description, whether for work or as an eating knife that they would use at most meals. I'll show you one of these and describe it for the folks listening. You might see something that looks like a 2/3 scale steak knife. There are no serrations, but it's very sharp and it's very finely pointed. And this is the kind of thing that people wore on their belt or carried in their purse. And they used it at most meals.
To eat with. So you'd have your own personal knife that you carried around?
Exactly. You wouldn't walk into a pub in Elizabethan London and find your cutlery set out for you. If you didn't have something of your own, you just use your hands or tip the bowl into your mouth. But you'd cut your meat up with this little knife, and then you'd spear it with this very sharp point and transfer it to your mouth very carefully. And that's how that was your fork, because they didn't use forks.
So it's not to cut yourself, right? Because you have that fear.
Yes, very careful. You don't want to stab yourself in the face. But the difference between that little eating knife and a weapon is whether the meat you're cutting is dead or still walking around in the pub giving you trouble, right? So everyone was armed in that sense. But I think your question probably refers more to whether or not Shakespeare carried a sword or rapier in his daily life.
It does, yes. Although I'm really excited to learn about the eating knife, because I didn't know everyone would have like their personal eating knife with them. But I was referring to like the dagger or the sword. You see those a lot in Shakespeare's plays, and I didn't know how much of that was theatrical and how much was something Shakespeare would have experienced himself.
Sure. To some degree, you have to think about how many guns you see in movies. Lots and lots of guns. You don't generally walk around the streets and find people shooting each other in the streets. But we do know that Shakespeare owned a sword because there was one in his will. And if you own a sword or rapier, you're likely to wear it at some point. But it was sort of expected of someone of Shakespeare's status to own a sword or rapier. If he had an audience with a wealthy patron or at court at some point, he would have put on his finest clothes, some jewelry, and strapped on a fine sword or rapier, not because he necessarily expected to be jumped in the street and used that as a weapon, but as a projection of his status and wealth, especially if it were decorated. It just sort of completed the picture of the Elizabethan gentleman. A ball gown looks great, right? But you don't want to wear it to weed your garden. A rapier looks great, but it can be inconvenient to move around in narrow streets and pubs and theaters, in this case, with 50 inches of sharp steel hanging almost horizontally on your hip.
It's going to be hard to turn around and navigate.
Right. And that could cause violence, obviously, if you bump into someone that way.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to make the wrong person mad that way. But what about Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet? We see Lord Capulet specifically get made fun of for his longsword. And the implication in the scene is that that's an old man's weapon and the young kids are using rapiers and daggers. And Shakespeare seems to use swords to draw a distinction based on age. Was the longsword an antiquated weapon when Shakespeare was writing this play?
Traditional might be a better word. It was still in use, certainly. It was a very agile and powerful cut and thrust weapon, about the same length and weight as the rapier, possibly slightly lighter, and still considered a foundational weapon of the European martial arts well into the 17th century. In fact, it was a popular weapon for judicial and extrajudicial duels, just like the rapier. So I'll show you something like what we're talking about here. This weapon I'm showing you is a hand-and-a-half sword, predating this period like 30 years or so. So it's just the sort of thing that Capulet might have standing behind a door ready to go. You see
that
here
is
in the scabbard.
I'm taking screen captures as we're talking. We'll put links to these weapons in the show notes for you to see. But this is a mighty looking weapon, certainly fitting for someone like Lord Capulet, with its quite ornate along the handle and very thick looking weapon.
And you would have used this on the battlefield or in a civilian carriage. And you see it can cut. It's got a good breadth across the cutting area, but it also has a very fine point that's stabbing. So it's what we call a cut and thrust weapon. This is not the sort of thing you would laugh about if someone threatened to bring it into a fight in the street, unless you were ignorant and arrogant and reckless, and that might be part of Shakespeare's point here, right? But if comedy is part of the intent, that might be due more to the age difference that we're talking about, as you say, or if Shakespeare is referring to the extremely long two-hand sword that was mainly a military weapon. If that thing appears on stage with a stooped old man opposite a fashionable young man with a rapier, people are going to laugh, right? But this scene might be a little bit more sophisticated than that. It might be very current social commentary. As the Italian rapier as a weapon in theory of fighting became popular in England, there was pushback from conservative Englishmen and masters of defense, including Shakespeare's contemporary George Silver, who kind of notoriously railed against the rapier and the Italian masters setting up in London to teach it. And you see this in Romeo and Juliet, too.
Because there was a huge fencing culture happening. Several of the fencing masters like Tybalt and Capoferro, you see them mentioned in The Princess Bride, and I like to draw people's attention to that because they were real people, and they used the rapier and dagger specifically. So you're saying George Silver was saying, no, that's not the right way to fight?
Yes, he's saying that's a continental form of fighting. It's Italian. It's strictly civilian. The rapier has no place on the battlefield where the good English weapons are to be found. And you see an expression of the concern among some of the Elizabethan English about the invasion of this weapon. In Romeo and Juliet, Mercutio praises Tybalt's rapier skill and calls him the very butcher of a silk button. Shakespeare is virtually quoting a notorious boast of one of those immigrant Italian masters named Rocco Bonetti. And in 1587, Bonetti was challenged and called into the street in front of his school by an Englishman armed with an English sword and buckler. And guess what weapon Bonetti grabbed to meet the challenge? A two-hand sword, a long sword like the one mentioned earlier.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and he was killed. The Englishman killed him, apparently with superior wrestling skills as they came to grips. Shakespeare's audience would have known all about Bonetti's boast. that he could hit any button upon an Englishman's doublet with a rapier, and how hollow that boast was in the end. And they probably even knew which weapon he had brought to that particular fight. So then you get Romeo and Juliet, and there it is up on the stage again, right?
Wow.
So then Romeo kills Tybalt, of course, in spite of this claimed skill. So there's a rich topical meaning for Shakespeare's original audience that's just kind of lost on us. We see it playing on the stage, but we don't see it in the same way his original audience did. So it's kind of ripped from the headlines, as we say, and it also reflects a certain amount of popular cultural stereotyping.
It didn't speak well to his boast either that he reached for the longsword instead of using the rapier he had boasted with in that
right.
Well.
Right. The Shakespeare's audience was familiar with all of these weapons, and they probably all had individual ideas about which were best and which were not best. And you see that as just kind of an everyday part of life in the Masters of Defense. Everyone had their own secret training. Everyone had their preference for which weapon was best. And Shakespeare's audience certainly was aware of that controversy.
Now, you alluded to this earlier, but in Hamlet and Laertes famously fight with a rapier and dagger quite specifically at the end of Hamlet. It's there in the stage directions. Shakespeare calls for this form of fighting a couple of times, which stands out to me because it's out of context for the time period when Hamlet was supposed to be written. And it's directly in context with when Shakespeare was writing the play itself. So Hamlet, the character, would not have used these weapons, but Shakespeare, the playwright, obviously knew about them. And as you're illuminating for us here, it was a big topic of conversation during Shakespeare's life. But I want to ask, what was the reality with fighting with rapiers in the streets of London? You said people weren't, dueling in the streets necessarily, but what would their connection have been when they saw Hamlet specifically choose this form of fighting at the end of the play?
Well, I think, again, we have to consider what that audience was prepared for. What we see in Hamlet isn't a duel. It would have been important to distinguish between a duel and a prize playing or a fencing contest. Those go back for centuries. And it might seem minor to us, but you would expect someone to die in a duel because somebody's been wronged to the point that one or the other can't go on living. Right. But we hear Hamlet apologize, and Laertes pretends to accept that because they don't want to bring that animosity to what's meant to just be a bloodless contest of skill. And again, when they're seen to wound each other, Claudius cries, "Part them," they're incensed, meaning stop the contest. They're actually mad at each other. You wouldn't say that in a duel, right? It's not supposed to happen.
Yeah, in a duel, you're supposed to be injuring the other person. Okay.
So the audience expects to see a friendly contest with equipment and rules designed to prevent injury. So Laertes' treachery in disabling the safety equipment, ignoring the rules, marks him as the dishonorable person there. So was there this kind of fighting in the streets of London? Maybe not lots of it with swords and rapiers, but there were laws against it. And you don't have laws against stuff people aren't doing, right? So again, look at poor Rocco Bonetti as an example. He was called into the street and killed. So it was happening. But these kinds of martial arts competitions like we see in Hamlet were common. So Shakespeare's audiences would have had a high standard for the fighting in his plays and would generally be well informed about martial arts. So if you're going to put it on the stage, it better be good.
It had to be correct, right?
Right. And the actors themselves were likely trained in lethal martial arts, and that would look very different on the theatrical stage compared to our meticulously choreographed modern stage fighting. It's important to note that the Elizabethan theater was sort of allied with the Masters of Defense. They shared the same physical geography. They shared the same physical spaces. The Masters of Defense rented theaters in the theater district. So you would see men going and coming with weapons on their hips a lot. And that might actually be one reason that Shakespeare would have worn something like that, because the culture immediately around him kind of praised that. And it might not have been socially acceptable elsewhere in the same city.
Would he have had these fencing masters as part of his playing company, training his actors to have this as a skill?
That seems very likely, yeah. And the actors themselves might have been interested in this if they aspired to, again, that picture of the Elizabethan gentleman. You would know how to fight. There were noblemen coming to these fencing schools constantly, so they'd be walking by the theater.
When we think of knights in sort of old England, we often think of trebuchets and longbows, the weapons of knights and King Arthur. But by Shakespeare's time, were these still part of the standard military weapons for people like the Earl of Essex, who was fighting wars in Ireland at this time? would he have had those kinds of weapons?
You would still see some very traditional medieval weapons on the field in Shakespeare's day compared to the time of, say, Henry V in the early 15th century. Guns of all kinds were common on the battlefield of Shakespeare's day, had not been in that earlier medieval period. The pike was something very old. It's actually an ancient weapon, but it was revived in the 16th century and later 15th century. That's a spear of about 16 to 20 feet. It would look strange to someone like Henry V, I think. And that's in the hands of well-trained, disciplined professional soldiers. That kind of professional army would have looked a little strange in the medieval period. But if you look specifically at John Derrick's illustrations of the Elizabethan conquest of Ireland, you'll see lots of men armed with guns and pikes, not so much the longbow. That's going out of use for technical reasons.
Now, when we were talking off the air before the episode, you mentioned edged weapons specifically from a cutler's perspective, but I'm afraid I don't know what a cutler is. So will you please define a cutler for us and explain how that person might have had a different perspective on weapons?
Sure. This is where we get the term cutlery. Cutler is just someone who makes knives and or swords. A sword cutler makes swords. Someone who uses these weapons needs them to behave in a consistent and predictable way. And it's the cutler's job to make sure that the weight and balance and design work in that way the user is trained for. So as a cutler, I pick up a sword and immediately think of how it feels in the hand, how that dictates the way it can be used, and how all that's achieved technically. Because you can pick up many reproduction swords and they just don't feel good, and that gives you a bad idea of how they were used historically.
Like my son takes fencing as one of the sports that he participates in, and they measure the rapier that he fences with based on its balance. And you're supposed to be able to put your finger on it, under it at a certain point, and it balances correctly. And that's what you're referring to with the weapons in Shakespeare's day, would have had similar ways of measuring whether or not it was built properly and would do its job effectively. And that was the cutler's job to make sure that occurred.
Right, and to know the difference between the way a long sword should balance and the way a rapier should balance, because they're very different, because they're used in different ways.
Well, who were developing these weapons? What was the motivation behind this innovative approach to weapons that we're seeing going on in Shakespeare's lifetime? Was this the military looking for a better fighting method, or were the fencing masters coming over from Italy really creating that much influence over weapons development during Shakespeare's lifetime?
Well, yeah, there's both a battlefield concern and there's also the concern of civilians carrying weapons where they had not always been able to do that and use those in different ways. Anybody making this stuff would be looking for useful innovations, but you need that feedback from people fighting duels or from fighting on the battlefield. In the case of swords, you need hilt designs that will protect the unarmored hand. That catches on with influential people, including wealthy patrons. Some monarchs took an interest in driving innovation in arms and armor. Henry VIII certainly did. Emperor Maximilian did. And once you get a single innovation, then the arms race is on, and that drives development of counter-innovation, and it goes back and forth forever.
Everybody wants to create the perfect combination.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned guns earlier, and I want to talk about that more specifically because I think it surprises people that there were firearms in England in the 16th century, and there are at least 5 references to guns in Shakespeare's plays that I was able to find. But can you explain what kind of gun Shakespeare would have been talking about? Specifically, I'm going to call out Henry VI, Part 2, where he talks about an overcharged gun. What should we be thinking of, or what should we expect to see on stage for that weapon?
That particular line probably refers to what we would call a cannon, which was in use on the battlefield in Henry's day. That's the War of the Roses. But it wouldn't be as nearly as refined as in the Elizabethan period. There's a century of difference between them technologically. But no matter the period or type of cannon, if you overcharge it by putting too much explosive in it, too much gunpowder, it can explode and kill the people around it. And in this line, even if the gun doesn't burst, Shakespeare is suggesting that it can simply recoil so severely that it endangers the people serving the gun. And what he's saying here, or what Margaret of Anjou is saying, is that if you are so outraged that you become blind in your rage at your enemies, that could end up harming you or harming Suffolk in that reference.
Was this the same gun that would get brought over to, I know I'm from the United States, so we think of colonial America as having this pistol with the double I don't know what they're called, on the back, where you cock the gun before you shoot it.
Yeah.
Was this a precursor to that, or is that a reasonable image for that kind of gun?
There were not nearly as many of those handguns, and that referred to anything that you could actually pick up and carry. During Henry's day, those muskets and things like that and pistols developed really in the 16th century, so that by Shakespeare's time, really all we had left to do was decide which of the ignition mechanisms was going to be most useful. Within 50 years of Shakespeare, we decided that the flintlock was the most efficient way of doing that. And so that's what came to the American colonies. But, colonization started in the early 17th century. So you had flintlock weapons, you had matchlock weapons, which are ignited by a piece of burning rope. And you had wheel locks, which is a very complex mechanism, sort of like a clock. Most of that was not all that useful in the colonial world, that early colonial world.
Now, so what was the most popular weapon? We've been talking about an arms race. What won out during Shakespeare's lifetime as the most preferred weapon to use?
Yeah, the rapier gets all the glory and the attention, but it was there and gone in only about a century of popular use. Probably the most common sword you would have found would have still been what resembles the old medieval sword, arming sword.
Tell me the difference between a broadsword and a long sword.
These are different ideas. The technical term broadsword is really probably a later term and most often refers to the Scottish basket hilt double-edged sword.
So that wasn't an English weapon at all.
Well, it probably originally was an English weapon. We don't know exactly where that developed, but the broadsword distinguishes it from a backsword. A broadsword has two edges, a backsword has only one edge. So that's the main difference there.
Right. Well, this is an elaborate topic. Obviously, we have many avenues that we can explore here, and we are very excited to explore further. So I'm hoping you can provide us with some recommended resources. What are some of your favorite books or places that you might recommend we go to learn more about weapons in Shakespeare's lifetime?
Well, to accompany this specific conversation, I would maybe recommend 3 titles. It's hard to beat Tobias Capwell's book, The Noble Art of the Sword, Fashion and Fencing in Renaissance Europe, 1520 to 1630. You can find that for around $30, and it's as good as everything else Toby writes. Sidney Anglow's book, The Martial Arts of Renaissance Europe, is probably more comprehensive and deals more with the individual masters of defense and development of martial arts in the period. It also costs a bit more, but if you're interested in the subject, I would say that's essential. You can actually get started on this topic right now for free if you search online for a paper titled The Blackfriars Gladiators, Masters of Fence, Playing a Prize, and the Elizabethan and Stuart Theatre by Ian Borden. That's a wonderful and enlightening resource that directly addresses this topic.
We will definitely link to those in the show notes for today's episode. Now, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I am supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so this choice would be in addition to those.
Well, I'm a writer with more stories in my head than I have time to write, so if you would let me have a blank book, I would be grateful.
Absolutely, and plenty of ink and pen.
Yeah.
Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Speaking of writing, I'm excited to just be finishing a novel for young readers set in the world of the English armor industry of the 15th century. So I'll be happy to get that done after many years.
This is a fictional story?
Yes. Fiction for middle grades or young readers. I also need to finish a scabbard for the little infantry sword that I said I've just finished. Is one of the most common you'd see in the Elizabethan world. And my brother just gave me a welder for my 50th birthday. So I need to learn how to use that so I can make the kinds of complex but plain sword hilts that I admire most.
What an amazing hobby. Well, Sean Flynt, this has been a great conversation. We've enjoyed having you here today and learning more about Elizabethan weapons. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
To see all of the resources that Sean recommends in today's episode, as well as pictures of the weapons he was kind enough to share with us today, you can visit the show notes for today's episode at castycash.com/episode 55. That's castycash.com/EP55. That's it for this week here at That Shakespeare Life. I'm Casty Cash, that Shakespeare girl, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into that Shakespeare life.